A red dress, a glittering ballroom, and a CEO everyone feared. By midnight, she was alone. One man, holding nothing but a glass of water, offered her more than help. He offered hope. Share where you're watching from in the comments and hit subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Her red dress shimmered under the golden light of the ballroom chandeliers. Every step she took felt rehearsed, almost like a performance designed to remind everyone in that room who she was. Isabel Rowan, the woman Chicago spoke of with awe and caution in equal measure, carried herself as if the night itself bent around her. People paused mid-conversation when she passed by. Men straightened their tone, women glanced down at their gowns, all of them measuring themselves against her presence. She wasn't just another guest at the gala. She was the reason people came, the reason they stayed, and the reason they left talking. The gala itself was a portrait of excess. Crystal chandeliers scattering light across mirrored walls, champagne glasses raised with forced laughter, a jazz band tucked in the corner, weaving trumpet notes through the air like threads of gold. It was the kind of night every executive circled on their calendar, not out of joy, but out of survival, because one wrong word to Isabel could end a career, and one well-timed compliment might open a door to power. Her gown, a flame of scarlet against the marble and glass, seemed alive. It was less fabric and more fire, pulling every gaze toward her. When she smiled, people leaned closer. When she laughed, they laughed with her, even if the joke carried no humor. There was calculation in every tilt of her glass, every lift of her chin, every precise pause before she spoke. She had built an empire on that precision. She had earned the kind of reputation that made her untouchable. But under the weight of a dozen champagne flutes, that precision began to fray. At first, it was subtle, a small stumble quickly masked by a laugh, a glass raised too quickly, the bubbles spilling just slightly onto her wrist. Most chose not to see it. They turned their faces away, pretending the center of their universe wasn't wobbling on its axis because Isabel Rowan was not supposed to falter. Not here. Not now. And yet the fire of her dress flickered differently as the night stretched on. What once looked like command now hinted at weariness. What once felt untouchable suddenly looked fragile. She moved through the shimmering crowd with a grace that was beginning to slip. The rhythm of her heels lost their perfect tempo against the marble floor. By midnight, her balance was no longer something she could simply will into place. Isabel Rowan, the CEO who bent conversations and futures with a single glance, stood at the edge of the ballroom, glassy-eyed, her hand brushing the doorframe as if the marble itself was the only thing keeping her upright. In that moment, beneath the lights and the music and the whispers that refused to carry, the untouchable woman everyone feared looked, for the first time, human. At the far edge of the ballroom, where the glow of the chandeliers softened into shadows, stood Daniel Archer, 32 years old, his suit pressed but plain, his shoes polished yet worn at the edges. He held nothing more than a glass of water in his hand, while others floated from circle to circle, laughing too loudly, reaching for another pour of champagne. Daniel remained still, not because he was shy, but because he had no reason to join them. His life didn't orbit around power or appearances. His world, his heart, belonged to a little girl named Maddie, sleeping peacefully miles away under the careful watch of the neighbor he trusted. Daniel had promised himself years ago that he would never waste nights chasing hollow approval. He had learned the hardest way possible that life could shift in a single phone call. The night his wife's laughter had been swallowed by the sound of tires on wet pavement. The night a drunk driver had carved a line straight through his future. Since then, every fizzing glass, every careless toast carried the weight of that loss. So he stayed sober, not out of discipline alone, but out of devotion. Because Maddie deserved a father who showed up steady and whole every single morning. He watched the gala with quiet eyes, the sequins and silk, the forced laughter echoing off marble walls. To most in that room, the night was survival. To him, it was an obligation, another line on the list that kept paychecks steady and food on the table. He wasn't there to impress Isabel Rowan or to be noticed at all. He was there because attendance was mandatory. His shoulders carried the weight of responsibility rather than ambition, and every glance at his watch was a silent reminder that bedtime stories had already passed without him. Yet, even as his mind wandered home, He couldn't help but notice her, the woman in red, commanding the room and unraveling beneath it at the same time. The crowd might have turned their eyes away, but Daniel's gaze, steady and unflinching, caught the subtle tremor in her step. The glass lifted one too many times. Where others saw only power, he saw the edges of exhaustion. Where others feared her, he recognized something different, fragility that no one dared to admit. The contrast between them was almost cinematic. Isabel, draped in firelight, her empire built on sharp intellect and harder choices. Daniel in the shadows, with his quiet strength carved from grief and fatherhood. She lived in a world of excess, surrounded by people who wanted something from her. He lived in a modest apartment, his evenings filled with the laughter of a child who wanted nothing more than her father's arms around her. And though their worlds seemed galaxies apart, fate was already beginning to close the distance. Daniel tightened his grip on the water glass, condensation slipping between his fingers. The sound of laughter and the clinking of crystal blurred into background noise. He was thinking of Maddie, her small chest rising and falling beneath the quilt his late wife had sewn, the soft curls of her hair pressed against her pillow. She was the pulse beneath every decision he made, the anchor that kept him grounded in a room full of people drifting on currents of ambition. Across the ballroom, Isabel's laugh rang out again, sharp, uneven. Daniel's jaw tightened. He didn't want to be here. Yet something told him that the night was shifting, that soon he would be forced to step out of the shadows. For now, though, he stayed where he was, a silent witness at the edge of splendor, holding nothing more than water in a sea of champagne. Daniel's hand tightened around the glass, the cool water pressing against his palm as if to remind him of the choice he had made long ago. To the people around him, champagne was a celebration, a sparkle in crystal, a promise of power and laughter. But to Daniel, every rising bubble was a warning. He couldn't look at it without remembering the night his world had splintered. Emily had been his anchor, the kind of woman whose laughter filled a room before she even stepped inside it. That night, years ago, she had called to say she was on her way home. He remembered the sound of rain against the windows, the steady hum of the refrigerator in their small kitchen, and Maddie's soft breaths from the crib in the other room. And then silence, a stranger's voice replacing hers, words he would never forget. There had been an accident, a drunk driver, a life stolen in the flash of headlights on wet asphalt. Since then, alcohol had never been indulgence, never a temptation. It was a marker carved in stone of what reckless choices could cost. He hadn't touched a drop since that night, not because he was afraid of losing control, but because he couldn't bear the thought of Maddie ever seeing her father stumble, or worse, vanish the way her mother had. She deserved better. She deserved safety, stability, mornings filled with pancakes and bedtime stories, not excuses drowned in liquor. As he stood at the edge of the gala, watching Isabel's glass refill again and again, unease settled deep in his chest. To everyone else, she was untouchable, a flame wrapped in red silk. But Daniel could see it, the slight falter in her steps, the sharper edges in her laughter, the way her pupils lagged a moment too long. He recognized the slope she was standing on because he had lived in the ruins at the bottom of it. He remembered the funeral, the way rain slid off black umbrellas like tears that refused to end. He remembered holding Maddie, barely a year old, while people whispered condolences that fell flat against his skin. He remembered swearing to himself that night. Alcohol would never again have a place in his home, in his life, in the world his daughter would grow up in. And he had kept that promise, one steady day after another. Now across the room, Isabel was unraveling in front of a crowd that refused to see it. They admired her fire but ignored the smoke. Daniel's jaw tightened as he followed her with his eyes. He didn't pity her, but he couldn't look away either. He knew too well how quickly a stumble could become a fall. Around him, the music swelled, laughter rose, and the clink of glass echoed like static. But Daniel stood still, holding fast to his water, his silence, his memories. The room celebrated power. He remembered loss. The crowd sought Isabel's attention. He sought only the steady rhythm of his daughter's breath waiting at home. Yet, beneath it all, an unease stirred, whispering that tonight might demand more from him than quiet observation. By the time the music thinned and the last of the champagne had gone flat, the ballroom no longer sparkled. What had begun as a storm of laughter and glass now echoed with the hush of heels slipping toward the exit, guests eager to disappear before the weight of their boss's shadow followed them home. The chandeliers still burned above, scattering light across polished marble. But the air felt different, emptied of its earlier bravado. At the center of it all, Isabel Rowan remained. The woman who had owned every glance now seemed a fraction smaller beneath the golden glow. Her assistants had vanished, her chauffeur nowhere in sight. For the first time in memory, she stood without an entourage, without the careful choreography that usually framed her nights. The glass in her hand trembled just enough for Daniel to notice, her laugh rising sharp, uneven, before dissolving into silence. When she moved toward the grand doors, her stride lacked its familiar precision. The rhythm of her heels, once a metronome that commanded attention, faltered against the marble. She reached for the frame as though the weight of her empire had suddenly settled on her shoulders all at once. People saw, of course, they always saw, but heads turned quickly. Conversations restarted in false bursts of chatter, eyes pretending to glance elsewhere. To acknowledge her weakness was to risk sharing in it, and no one in that room was willing to take that risk. No one, except the man at the edge. Daniel lingered near the exit, water glass empty in his hand, his body already angled toward the door, ready to leave this glittering theater of ambition. But when his gaze landed on Isabel, unsteady and alone, something inside him refused to follow the crowd. He had lived too long in the aftermath of people turning away, too long in the silence left behind when no one stepped forward. He couldn't walk past her. Not tonight. He set the glass on a nearby tray and straightened, his movements deliberate, calm. Each step toward her carried the quiet weight of choice, not obligation. As he closed the distance, he kept his voice low, gentle enough not to carry across the marble hall. "Ma'am," he said carefully, his tone steady, respectful, but firm. "Do you need a ride?" Isabel turned, her pupils slow to find him. Recognition flickered, blurred by the haze of champagne. Her lips curved into a bitter smile, the kind that lacked her usual precision. "Williams," she slurred, using his last name as though formality might shield her. Then softer, almost mocking herself, "The single right." Daniel didn't flinch. He simply nodded, his jaw steady. "Yes, let me drive you home. It's late. It's not safe." Her pride rose like a shield, even dulled by alcohol. "I don't need your help. I have drivers, cars, everything." She gestured vaguely toward the valet stand, now empty, deserted like the ballroom itself. Daniel's eyes didn't waver. "Not tonight, you don't," he said quietly. There was no judgment in his tone, only a calm certainty that left little room for argument. "Please trust me." For a long moment, Isabel stared at him, the silence stretching between them like a test. Then, with a frustrated sigh, the kind that sounded more like surrender than defeat, she let her hand drop from the marble frame. Without another protest, she allowed Daniel to guide her forward, her steps uneven but steadier beside him in that fragile walk toward the door. Beneath chandeliers that had witnessed her rise and now her falter. Isabel Rowan's power looked different. It wasn't in the fire of her gown or the sharpness of her eyes. It was in the simple act of letting someone see her weakness, if only for a moment. The night air outside was sharp, cutting through the lingering perfume of the ballroom. Isabel's heels clicked once more against the marble before she sank reluctantly into the passenger seat of Daniel's sedan. The door closed with a muted thud, sealing her inside a world that did not belong to her. No polished leather, no tinted glass, no hum of a chauffeur waiting for orders. Just fabric seats, the faint scent of pine from a clipped air freshener, and a dashboard worn from use. Daniel slid behind the wheel, fastening at his seatbelt with a quiet efficiency. He glanced at her once, then forward again, his voice steady. "You'll want yours on," he said softly. Isabel bristled at the suggestion, her pride reflexive, but her fingers obeyed. The click of the buckle echoed louder than the fading jazz still ringing in her ears. As the car eased away from the curb, hotel lights receded into the rear view, swallowed by the darker pulse of Chicago streets. For a while, neither spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable, only unfamiliar, filled by the hum of the engine and the rattle of a loose coin in the cup holder. Isabel leaned her head against the cool window, neon lights smearing past like paint brushed over glass. And then, almost to herself, her words slipped free. "Everyone thinks success is glamorous," she murmured, her voice softer than Daniel had ever heard. "That power makes you invincible." A dry laugh caught in her throat. "But it's lonely. They don't see me, they see the CEO, not the woman." Daniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly, though his gaze never left the road. He let a pause stretch before answering, his tone quiet. "I think everyone has their battles. Some just hide them better than others." Her eyes flicked toward him, sharper now, curiosity breaking through the haze. "And what's yours, Archer?" He hesitated, the way a man does before reopening an old wound. His knuckles whitened against the wheel, his breath measured. When he finally spoke, the words were low, deliberate, carrying the weight of years. "I lost my wife. Drunk driver. Since then, my battle is making sure my daughter grows up safe, with someone who won't let her down." The words cut through the fog of champagne like cold water. Isabel blinked, the haze in her eyes clearing for a moment, sobered not by will but by the quiet force of his truth. She turned, studying him, not as the single father employee who stood at the edge of her meetings, but as a man carved by grief, refusing to surrender to it. She shifted slightly in her seat, the sequins of her gown rustling against the worn fabric. "And you just carry that alone." Her voice was almost fragile, as though admitting her own fear. Daniel didn't look at her, but there was no bitterness in his tone, only resolve. "It's not about me, it's about Maddie. She deserves to grow up in a world steadier than the one I was given that night." The city lights stretched ahead, endless ribbons of gold and red. But inside the car, something quieter took shape. Two lives, one hardened by loneliness, the other by loss, brushed against each other in unspoken recognition. Isabel rested her head back, the fire of her gown dimmed now against the simplicity of his presence. For the first time that night, she looked at Daniel Archer not with calculation, not with authority, but with a flicker of something rare: respect. The elevator chimed softly as Daniel guided Isabel through the lobby of her building, his arms steady beneath hers. The marble floors reflected their steps, chandeliers overhead scattering light across polished stone. The concierge glanced up with a start, then wisely looked away. Even here, Isabel's reputation followed her. Untouchable, commanding. But tonight, her balance leaned against Daniel's quiet strength. When the elevator doors opened to her penthouse, the contrast struck him. Glass walls framed a skyline that glittered like spilled diamonds. Sleek furniture sat in perfect symmetry, every surface immaculate. It was a palace in the sky, but to Daniel, it was only a place she needed to be safe for the night. He didn't linger on the wealth. He had long stopped measuring himself against lives like this. His only concern was getting her through the door without falling. "Sit," he said gently, easing her onto a white sofa that seemed too pristine for comfort. Isabel exhaled sharply, one hand pressing against her temple, as if the night itself weighed heavy on her skull. Without a word, Daniel crossed the room, his steps quiet against the polished floor. He filled a crystal glass with water at the kitchen sink and set it carefully on the low table before her. "You'll feel better after this," he murmured. His tone was neither commanding nor deferential, but simply human. Isabel's eyes fluttered up to him, glazed yet searching. "Why are you helping me?" Her voice was rough at the edges, frayed by champagne and pride. "You could have left. You could laugh about this tomorrow with the others." Daniel's expression didn't change. He stood tall but calm, his hands loose at his sides. His voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of a man who had lived what he spoke. "Because I know what it's like when no one's there." The simplicity of the words struck harder than any grand speech could. For a moment, the armor she had worn for years, polished, flawless, impenetrable, softened into something fragile. She stared at him, the silence stretching long enough to reveal what she didn't say. That kindness, this unassuming, was rarer than power. Daniel didn't press the moment. He didn't linger to see if she would drink the water, didn't wait for gratitude or acknowledgement. He only gave her space to breathe. "Good night, ma'am," he added softly. respectful as ever. Then he turned toward the door. The sound of it closing behind him was gentle, almost careful, as if he understood she needed silence more than company. Isabel sat alone in the vast quiet of her penthouse, staring at the untouched glass, condensation already forming a faint ring on the table. She wondered when the last time someone had thought first of her well-being, not her image. For a woman who had built her empire on control, that realization was disarming. And yet, beneath the shame, beneath the fog of champagne, a single truth lingered in the space he had left behind. She had not been alone tonight. Sunlight spilled across the penthouse, too bright for the state Isabel found herself in. She winced, pressing a hand to her temple. The memories of the night before threaded themselves back together in fragments. The laughter that had turned sharp, the stumble at the ballroom doors, the weight of a steady arm guiding her forward, and then him, Daniel Archer. Her gaze drifted to the low glass table where the crystal glass still sat untouched. A faint ring of dried condensation circled beneath it, a quiet reminder that someone had thought first of her well-being, not her image. It was such a simple thing, water in a glass. But to Isabel, it felt heavier than the endless bottles of champagne that had led her here, because no one in her world offered kindness without expecting something in return. No one, except him. For years, she had built walls as high as the skyline outside her windows. Power had been her shield, control her currency. She had learned to let people see only the polished surface, never the cracks beneath. But last night, against her will, those walls had shifted, and a man she'd barely noticed before, quiet, unpolished, steady, had seen past it all. Not to exploit, not to gloat, but to make sure she was safe. A ripple of shame crawled through her chest, hot and unfamiliar. Isabel Rowan did not stumble. She did not lean on strangers. She did not wake up to find evidence of her weakness sitting like an accusation on her table. Yet, beneath the shame, tangled somewhere deeper, was gratitude, a strange, unsettling gratitude that refused to be dismissed. She rose slowly, each step through the vast quiet of her penthouse echoing too loudly. The skyline beyond her windows glittered like diamonds scattered carelessly across the morning, mocking in its brilliance. She wrapped her arms around herself, not for warmth, but for grounding. The city would never know how close its most untouchable figure had come to falling. But she knew. And she knew one man had chosen not to turn away. Isabel's mind replayed his words, quiet but unwavering, because I know what it's like when no one's there. She had dismissed so many people over the years, categorized them as either useful or irrelevant. Yet Daniel Archer had stood apart. He had not sought her approval, had not feared her reputation. He had only offered a hand when she needed it most, then left without waiting for recognition. It unsettled her more than she wanted to admit, because kindness like that was foreign to her world, rarer than power, harder to control, and she was not sure what to do with it. The untouched glass remained where he had left it, catching the morning light. Isabel stared at it a long while, her reflection faint in its surface. For the first time in years, she felt something she had almost forgotten. Seen, not as a CEO, not as an empire, but as a woman, and the thought both shamed her and softened her in equal measure. The following morning slipped into routine at Rowan Industries. The glass-walled tower in the heart of Chicago hummed with its usual rhythm. Assistants hurried past each other with files tucked close to their chests. Executives rehearsed numbers under their breath, and the sound of clicking heels echoed against marble floors like a metronome of precision. At the center of it all sat Isabel Rowan, her desk immaculate, her schedule stacked, her gaze sharp enough to cut through excuses before they were spoken. Yet, beneath the polish, something had shifted. She pressed the intercom, her voice calm but edged with something unfamiliar. "Send in Archer." The room outside hushed for a moment. Daniel Archer was not the man anyone expected to be summoned by name. He was steady, quiet, a man who kept to the periphery of meetings and left promptly at 5 to make it home to his daughter. Still, when he entered, his shoulders squared as though bracing for reprimand, his hands clasped lightly behind his back. "You asked for me, ma'am." His voice was measured, cautious. For a moment, Isabel only studied him, not the suit that carried more wear than shine, not the posture of a man who lived by responsibility rather than ambition, but the steadiness that had kept her from unraveling entirely the night before. Then, with a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, she spoke. "Thank you for last night." Daniel nodded once, awkward but sincere. "Just doing the right thing." "No," she said, leaning forward, her voice low, deliberate. "It was more than that. You reminded me of something I had forgotten. That kindness is rarer than power. You didn't take advantage. You didn't gossip. You respected me when I couldn't respect myself." Her words hung between them, heavy, undeniable. For the first time, the staff outside Isabel's office would have been astonished to see her tone soften, her gaze no longer just calculating, but acknowledging. Daniel bowed his head slightly, humbled, and answered simply, "You're welcome." From that day, the change was quiet but unmistakable. In meetings where Isabel once let her executives battle for her attention, she began pausing, turning unexpectedly to him. "Archer, what do you think?" The room would still, eyes shifting toward the man who had never sought the spotlight. Daniel would clear his throat, speaking plainly without polish or ambition. To his surprise, Isabel would listen. Sometimes she even nodded, taking his words into account as though they carried the same weight as her senior analyst. Outside the boardroom, the change was subtler still. During a morning briefing, she asked about Maddie. The question startled the room into silence. Daniel hesitated, unsure whether to reveal pieces of the life he guarded so carefully. But Isabel's eyes held none of the sharp judgment people feared, only a steady curiosity, as though his daughter mattered in a way that numbers and reports never could. Whispers soon circled among the staff. The CEO seemed different, not softer exactly, but more human. Some speculated Archer had done something, though no one knew what. Others dismissed it as a passing whim. Daniel ignored the talk. He wasn't chasing favor, wasn't angling for position. His world still revolved around bedtime stories and the laughter of a little girl waiting at home. But Isabel knew the truth of it. She felt the shift within herself. The cracks in her armor were no longer something to fear, but something that let her breathe. And at the center of that shift stood the man who had carried her dignity when she had been too unsteady to carry it herself. Trust does not arrive all at once. It comes in the fragments, in moments so small they might almost be overlooked. For Isabel Rowan, it began with the simplest of gestures, turning toward Daniel Archer in a meeting, not as a subordinate to be measured, but as an equal to be heard. For Daniel, it began with the quiet realization that her questions about Maddie were not rehearsed or strategic. She truly wanted to know. At first, he tread carefully. Years of living as a single father had taught him to guard what mattered most. His daughter was his world, and his grief was a scar he carried close. Yet, as days turned into weeks, he found himself lowering those defenses, piece by piece. When Isabel asked about Maddie's favorite bedtime story, his answer came without hesitation. When she wondered aloud how he managed school pickups with the demands of work, his response was honest, touched with the kind of humor born only from lived chaos. And to his quiet surprise, she didn't dismiss those details. She listened. For Isabel, the act of listening was unfamiliar in this way. She had spent years commanding boardrooms, silencing objections with a glance. But with Daniel, she found herself setting aside the armor of authority. She discovered that conversations could carry weight without power, that connection could grow not from deals struck, but from truth shared. His presence reminded her that strength was not always sharp-edged. Sometimes it was steady, patient, and willing to carry another when they faltered. In return, Daniel began to see the woman behind the title, the Isabel who stayed late, not because ambition demanded it, but because going home to silence was harder than staying in the noise. The Isabel whose sharp edges softened when she spoke of books she had read as a child, or the way she paused by the window, when the city light stretched below her like an ocean of stars. He saw not the CEO, untouchable and precise, but a woman who had built her life on walls high enough to keep everyone out, and now, cautiously, was letting him step inside. The staff whispered, "Of course." Some claimed Archer had won her favor through some hidden strategy. Others dismissed the changes as fleeting. But Daniel paid no mind. He wasn't seeking advancement. He still hurried home to Maddie, still read bedtime stories in the worn armchair that smelled faintly of his late wife's perfume. Yet something new threaded through those nights. The memory of a glance exchanged across a boardroom, a quiet acknowledgement that he was no longer invisible. For Isabel, the shift ran deeper. She had convinced herself for a year that vulnerability was weakness. Yet Daniel's refusal to ask for anything in return, his simple consistency, challenged that belief. He made her consider, for the first time in a long time, that power did not have to cancel out humanity. That perhaps in the quiet trust forming between them, there was a different kind of strength, one that did not isolate, but connected. And so, without either of them naming it, a bond began to take shape, fragile at first, but real. The kind of bond that does not announce itself with grand gestures, but grows in the steady rhythm of trust. Two lives, once defined by loneliness and loss, now carried the possibility of something more. The weeks that followed unfolded in a rhythm both of them had quietly begun to expect. Work ended, conversation stretched just a little longer, and silences between them no longer felt like absence, but like space to breathe. One evening, as the sun dipped low over Chicago, Isabel closed her office with a final click, her schedule behind her, the city ahead. Daniel was gathering his reports, ready to head home, when her voice broke the stillness. "Walk with me." It was not a command, it was almost a request. They stepped out into the evening air, the streets humming with life, the skyline bathed in copper light, skyscrapers edged with gold, as if the city itself had softened for a moment. For once, Isabel wasn't flanked by assistants or drivers. There was no polished car waiting, no entourage to part the crowd. It was just her and Daniel, their footsteps falling in rhythm against the busy pavement. At first, they walked in silence, the kind that said more than words could. Isabel's gaze lifted to the horizon, her face touched by the last glow of sunset. Daniel kept his eyes forward, steady as always, his thoughts on Maddie, though for the first time in a long time, his world didn't feel quite so narrow. The noise of the city rose around them, horns, voices, the rush of traffic. But between them there was quiet, a small circle of calm carved out of chaos. As they crossed the street, Isabel's hand brushed against his, light as a whisper, as though by accident. Daniel slowed, glancing down, his instinct to retreat, to pull back into the boundaries he had built for years. Yet he didn't. She hesitated, then reached again, deliberate this time, her fingers sliding into his. The contact was simple, almost ordinary, and yet, for both of them, it was a threshold. Isabel, who had lived behind walls so high no one could scale them, let her guard slip in that small touch. Daniel, who had carried grief like armor, allowed himself to feel something he had long considered impossible. They walked on, hand in hand, neither of them naming what it meant. The city roared around them, neon signs flickering to life, the evening crowd pushing past. But inside that fragile connection, there was stillness, a bond not built on status or ambition, not on desperation or escape, but on the quiet recognition of two people who had once stood alone and now chose, tentatively, to walk side by side. At the corner, Daniel glanced at her, uncertain, and Isabel, for perhaps the first time in years, didn't wear the mask of a CEO. She didn't smile, but her eyes held something different, softer, steady, a promise unspoken. It was enough to steady him, to assure him he wasn't walking this path alone. As the last sliver of sun slipped behind the buildings, painting the sky in violet and rose, the future stretched before them, uncertain, but alive. In that moment, they carried not the weight of what they had lost, but the beginning of what they might find. In the heart of a glittering ballroom where power and pretense danced under crystal chandeliers, Isabel Rowan reigned as the untouchable CEO, fierce, flawless, and feared. Yet beneath her scarlet gown, loneliness simmered like a hidden flame, extinguished only by the haze of champagne. It was Daniel Archer, the quiet single dad haunted by his own scars of loss, who saw her not as an empire, but as a fragile soul teetering on the edge. With nothing but a glass of water in hand and a heart forged in grief, he stepped forward when others turned away, offering a ride home that became a bridge between worlds. His simple act of kindness, driving her safely, sharing his pain, leaving water by her side, shattered her walls of isolation, reminding her that true strength lies in vulnerability, not invincibility. This story whispers a profound life lesson. In a world obsessed with status and success, the most transformative power comes from unassuming compassion. We often armor ourselves against judgment, hiding our fractures behind titles and triumphs, fearing that showing weakness will unravel us. But Daniel teaches us that extending a hand in someone's darkest hour doesn't diminish us. It elevates everyone. It's a reminder that beneath every polished facade beats a human heart yearning for genuine connection, not conquest. Isabel's morning awakening, marked by gratitude and change, shows how one selfless gesture can rewrite narratives, fostering respect, trust, and even love where none seem possible. In our own lives, amid the rush of ambition and grief, let's pause to see the person, not the position. Kindness isn't a weakness. It's the quiet force that heals, unites, and redeems. It echoes that hope often hides in ordinary moments, like a midnight drive or a shared silence, proving second chances bloom when we least expect them. If this tale stirred something in your soul, share your thoughts below. Have you ever experienced a moment of unexpected kindness that changed your path? Tell us where you're watching from and if you believe in the magic of second chances. And if heartwarming stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button now. Your support keeps these tales of humanity alive, one emotional journey at a time.